This week we're focusing on women's sexuality and sexual rights. The reading assigned for the module goes a bit more in depth into some of the concepts we've covered in earlier modules, so for this lecture, I want us to take a historical perspective on women's sexuality. The expression of sexuality and fertility is not a new phenomenon. These are topics that have always been central to what makes us human and allows us to continue as a species. Yet our conceptualizations of sexuality have changed over time due to social and economic developments that have impacted women and men differently. Let's begin with a famous Greek poem. What we're seeing here is what's called Fragment 31, and it was written by the Greek poet Sappho, who lived on the island of Lesbos. And if you take a little time to read through the poem, what you will see is that this is one of her most famous works, and that many translators and literary scholars actually see the poem as an ode to the anxiety of attraction and a confession of love from one woman to another. Within that first stanza, Sappho introduces us to three main characters of the poem: the speaker, the beloved, and the man she is speaking to. In the very first line, we learn that the speaker is impressed with the man, even to the point of defying him. However, the speaker doesn't admire him because of his own merit, but because he gets to sit with and speak to the woman who Sappho addresses as you throughout the poem. The speaker describes the couple as if looking at them from afar, watching the two of them seated across from one another and speaking closely to each other. So who was Sappho? Well, she was a Greek poet who lived around 630 to 570 BCE. At this time, poems were actually sung and accompanied by a lyre, which is one of the instruments that you see here on the piece of pottery that's included. The subject matter of her poetry suggests that she identified as a lesbian. As I said, she lived on the island of Lesbos, which does provide the origin for the word lesbian nowadays. She was the head of what's called a thiasos, and that it was a community of women who could receive a limited form of education. So it was basically a school for girls. There were likely lesbian relationships between students and teachers in the thialos, but what we actually know about her and most women in ancient Greece is quite limited. Among these women, there's two dominant sort of city-states or cultures within Greece that we know the most about. The first being Athens, and in that case, women were not considered citizens. They had very limited rights, tended to be confined to their home, and really were seen mostly as just the bearers of children. In Sparta, on the other hand, another famous city-state, we see that even though women had a little more rights, they were still excluded from political life. They were seen more as, honorary figures who helped to produce warriors. They did own some property, had some education, were able to go around as they pleased, and actually competed in competitive events as well. Why we know so little about women in ancient Greece comes back to the fact that women's sexuality was bound in bearing children, being their primary function. When it comes to the men, and we look at ancient Greek sexuality for men, there tend to be two roles: that of the active penetrator or passive, whoever is passively penetrated. In this case, the dominator or penetrator is associated with masculinity, high social status, and adulthood, whereas the passive or penetrated person is associated with femininity, low social status, and youth. Homosexual relationships between men were quite common, definitely in military situations to help build morale. There are also, incidences of just courage motivated by this sort of homoerotic bond that they engage in. A famous example of this is Achilles and Patroclus, from the Iliad. Unlike the depiction we see in Troy, where Patroclus, I can't say that name, is depicted as Achilles' nephew or cousin, I can't remember. In the poem itself, he's actually his lover, and so when he dies in Achilles' place, Achilles is after revenge for the death of his lover. When it comes to women and their sexuality in ancient Greece, We have, firstly, we have the male perspective on women's sexuality as provided by Demosthenes in the 4th century BCE. Here he is describing the heterae, who are courtesans who have relationships with men one at a time. They tend to be very long-term relationships and also provide the men with intellectual stimulations in addition to sex. He also describes what are called palakai, and these were slave concubines. And lastly, Genakis. I am not a Greek speaker, so I'd probably butchering that, but that's the term they used for wives in ancient Greece. Despite this sort of perspective that you can see here in the quote, we do know that there were lesbians in ancient Greece because of Sappho, but also because in his writings on Sparta, Plato actually describes women who do not care for men but have female attachments. Over time, the Thealos schools disappear, marriage begins to organize Greek culture, and women become more confined to their homes. In fact, a girl's duty and destiny was to give her love to the man who would one day be her husband. Female-female love had no place within the constraints of this new social organization. However, male homosexuality did continue. Next, if we switch our focus to ancient Rome, we have what are called the Vestal virgins, and these are women who served as the priestesses to the god Vesta. She was the goddess of the hearth and the home. These women were required to take a 30-year chastity vow to devote themselves to state rituals, and it's believed that the practice started with 6 young women who originally were selected from wealthy families within the city. These women essentially functioned as surrogate housekeepers for all of Rome, and they served at the will of the emperor. Their responsibilities included maintaining the sacred fire to Vesta, which is seen as this sort of household flame in all Roman households, collected sacred water, prepared food for rituals, and also cared for sacred objects and legal documents. Sexual relationships with a Vestal virgin was considered an act of treason. If you engaged in this sort of relationship, you were buried alive with only a few days of food and water, so pretty brutal punishment. The clothing that these women tend to be depicted wearing signifies that they are both a bride and a matron. We see them in white and covered, which tends to be associated with purity. They wear a hair ribbon like a bride, a veil, but a very different one from what you see on a bride at that time. And these sort of long, very well-covered robes that depict, again, this sort of matronly persona, and really is much more of a hands-off sort of idea. When it comes to Roman women and their sexuality, they are considered citizens, however they can't vote or hold office. Women are considered virgins until they're married and become a sexual belonging of their husband as well as the state. They had limited education, and based on wealth and status, of course, some of them also served as concubines, while others were legitimate wives. When it comes to sexuality, it was emphasized as only taking place within marriage, tied again to bearing children. The control of sexuality was important in this case for the continuation of the state, marriages, households. This gets down to this sort of power relationship that we see even more in other cases. A comparison of sexuality between males and females. Within Roman society, for men, male-male relationships were acceptable for free-born Roman men, and they tended to be expected, actually, to have both female and male partners, but only male partners if they were seen as the one having the dominant role. Women, on the other hand, had to have sex that included a dominant partner. They were not allowed to have any kind of female-female relationships without penetration. And during the empire, women were described with the sexual appetite of men and other sorts of male characteristics. And this may actually indicate a sort of growing independence of women and other sorts of cultural anxieties that were developing at that time. Jumping ahead to the medieval period, we see that women had no sexual identity, so they were considered virgins until they were married. And then in that case, this sexual identity was ascribed to them, not self-created by themselves. After marriage, their sexuality was controlled by their husbands. In this case, men are the ones who are transforming their wives from a virgin into a woman by consummating the marriage, which was meant to result in pregnancy. And if there was any sort of infidelity that happened within a marriage, it was usually only the women who were punished for those sorts of activities. When we look at sexuality in the medieval church, it was seen as being disruptive to men, sexually predatory sorts of behaviors. Well, women's lust in this case was seen as a sin. Women were meant to remain without sexual identity until they were married, and even then, sex during marriage was meant solely for procreation. Sex was, however, forbidden on Sundays, sometimes on Fridays and Wednesdays, during All Saints' feast days, Lent or Advent, and even at times when a woman was considered to be impure, which usually meant during her menstrual cycle, within 40 days after giving birth, or during pregnancy or while nursing. Prostitution was seen as a necessary evil and a public utility for preventing men from committing worse sins. When it comes to homosexuality in medieval Europe, the attitudes towards that behavior varied from region to region and tended to be determined by religious culture. Although homosexuality was not considered a major offense during the early Roman Empire, homosexual encounters and homosexual behavior came to be viewed as unacceptable as Christianity developed. By the 11th century, sodomy was increasingly viewed as a serious moral crime and punishable by mutilation or death. And we have medieval records that actually reflect this sort of growing concern. When it comes to educational opportunities and knowledge for women at this time, women were considered to be intellectually inferior and were not often educated. Nuns were one of the few exceptions, and these tended to be women who came from wealthy families. They were able to become highly educated within the convent and even rise themselves to have a similar rank to their male counterparts. However, in this case, you're giving up, having any kind of sexual relationship in order to get knowledge. So what this really comes down to is a repression of your sexuality in order to be educated. One very interesting historical example is Sister Juliana Morel. She was a 17th century Spanish Dominican nun and actually became the first woman in the Western world to earn a university degree. She was a bit of a child prodigy, as it seems. According to the records, at age 12, she defended her law thesis, received her doctorate in law at age 14, and then took her final vows to become a nun at the age of 17. So, worked her way up. She's a very impressive figure and showed what could be achieved through the education offered to women at this time by means of the church. Male sexuality in the church, however, said that all clergy were supposed to be celibate, except we have one very interesting example, counterexample to that is Pope Alexander the Sixth, I believe that is, also known as Rodrigo de Borgia, and so perhaps you've heard of the drama series on Showtime about the family, the Borgias. Well, he went on to have relationships with two women, one while he was a priest, and then fathered 4 children. And again, he had another relationship with a different woman with whom he had a daughter while he was actually serving as Pope. And in this particular case, he ended up using his children to gain power, put them in positions of power within the church, also marrying off his daughters to influential families. So a bit of a double standard coming into play in that case. Now we can jump forward a bit in time to the 1920s. We see what's nowadays called the flapper culture. It's during post-World War I, and this sort of phenomenon was tied to also first wave feminism that we've covered earlier on in the semester. During the war, many women started working and found a sort of economic independence, and with that, this led to the development of new gender identities, and as well as freer expression of sexuality. And this manifested itself as a sort of defiance of cultural norms. At this time, women smoked and drank, they cut their hair very short, were no longer wearing strict corsets, but short dresses, and also dressed quite androgynously. Excuse me. Between the two world wars, it was an interesting time to be living in Berlin in the 1920s. It was considered a gay capital. There were over 500 venues for homosexual men, lesbians, and transgender people to express themselves and meet each other. At this time, sexuality and sexual identity were freely expressed. Transgenderism, homosexuality, and many other sorts of sexual freedoms were definitely in practice. It was also at this time that the Institute for Sexual Research was founded in 1919 by a young doctor named Magnus Hirschfeld. The stated purpose of the Institute was to be a place of research, teaching, healing, and refuge that could free the individual from physical ailments, psychological afflictions, and social deprivation. It was also a place for education. While in medical school, Hirschfeld had experienced the trauma of watching as a gay man, who he himself was as well, was paraded naked before the class to be verbally abused as a degenerate. He went on to provide sex education and health clinics, advice on contraception, and research on gender and sexuality, both anthropological and psychological. He worked tirelessly at this time to overturn what's called Paragraph 175 within Germany. It's a famous part of the German criminal code that made homosexuality illegal. While he wasn't able to turn that over completely, he was able to get some transvestite identity cards legally accepted for some of his patients, and this allowed them to live as themselves, dressing openly as the opposite sex, expressing themselves as they truly saw their identity. Unfortunately, this institute ultimately did succumb to Nazism, and the institute was ransacked. The books, this entire library of all of his research, the sort of history that was provided to transgender, bisexual, lesbian, and gay people at the time was burned. So really quite a loss of this history and this important period of research as well. Other researchers have seen and interpreted this period of homosexual expression within Berlin as being tied to soldiers who were returning from the front. Soldiers returning from the war had a different type of attitude towards their own sexual behavior than they would have previously, so perhaps that was a contributing factor to this sort of gay renaissance at the time. After World War II, we see, again, a suppression of women's sexuality, the devaluation of their work, this return to the household and, sexual identities defined within a marriage, and having children. This, we ultimately then see the backlash of that being second-wave feminism and a freer expression of sexuality, as well as the sexual revolution that we covered previously. Women, just like men, enjoyed having sex and had sexual needs that needed to be fulfilled. This brings us to some more recent examples of firsts, even within our state here of Arizona. Senator KYRSTEN SINEMA, she was not only the first female senator from the state, but was the first openly bisexual congresswoman. She was even sworn into office on copies of the U.S. Constitution and Arizona Constitution rather than the Bible. Another even more recent example is Dr. Rachel Levine, who is a professor of pediatrics and psychiatry at the Penn State College of Medicine, and earlier this year she was appointed Assistant Secretary of Health. She's the first openly transgender person to be nominated and confirmed for a cabinet position within the United States. Her and SINEMA, as public figures, the visibility of these women is important, and we've seen many other examples of lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women being elected to office or gaining notoriety through other public-facing careers. So it appears that these tides are again turning.